Hello, we are back, and I really realized I wanted to talk into the myth of Inanna and Ereshkigal as we journey with Venus, because I feel like it is such a beautiful story to embody the work that we do with Venus. So I'm going to speak into it now, and let me check the time, if this gets too long, we'll make it 3 videos. But the story of Inanna and her sister Ereshkigal goes back to Mesopotamian times, so biblical days. And this Inanna becomes the symbol of Venus, okay? But in actual fact, Inanna and her sister Ereshkigal are kind of like the two different sides of Venus in many ways. They are both bringing in some Venus energy. And Inanna was a goddess of earth and sky, and she was well loved, well revered, and just generally a favorable goddess. And Ereshkigal was her sister, who was the queen of the underworld. And as you can imagine, the goddess of earth and sky was more um, pleasant to look upon and be blessed by and deal with than the goddess of the underworld. So that was kind of their dynamic. But in the meantime, Inanna's sister's husband passed, and Ereshkigal was in the underworld, very heavily pregnant with her child. Her lover had just died, and Inanna felt deeply called to go down to the underworld to be with her sister. But it's much easier to get into the underworld than out of the underworld. So Inanna spoke to her handmaiden and friend, her confidant, and said, I'm going down to see my sister, but if I'm not back in 3 days, please come and find me. And she began her descent. Now, I did mention in the previous video that there is that beautiful way that Venus moves through the sky, the Venus star point. And the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld is actually the story of the Venus retrograde process, which happens every 18 months. I can't recall if any of us, I certainly don't, but have a Venus retrograde in our chart. So we'll have a look when we look at the charts. But suffice to say that this is a cycle that in our inner work we repeat. And Venus is doing a retrograde this year. She didn't do one last year. She's doing one in Leo this year. So it's an extra, even though it's only happening in late July, it's a very good opportunity for us to start to embody and understand what this is. So we'll work through our Venus this month, but then recognize when we get to Venus retrograde, July, August, that's when we're really going to feel this Inanna story even more strongly. So possibly, I think I will actually just record this as a separate recording, and you can come back to just the Inanna myth when you are ready to reflect more deeply and fully in your Inanna underground journey. So basically, Inanna heads into the underworld, but it's easier to get in than out, but it's still a journey to get in. So she has to go from this beautiful space, light open, where she is very revered, and she has to go down, descending, descending, descending through the 7 gates of the underworld, which links to our 7 chakras. And each time she gets to one of the gates, she has to remove an item of her clothing. So a bit like strip poker, it's easy to remove the jersey and less easy to remove the bra. So each time, and actually in her case, it was sort of more intimate items of clothing as well. So not the jersey, for example, like a crown and jewelry and undergarments and things. But each item of clothing that she had to release was a little harder, and it left her feeling more exposed, more vulnerable. It's like peeling back the layers of the onion. And bearing in mind, she was the queen where she came from, where everyone looked highly upon her, and she didn't have a lot of challenge because she was loved, revered, got everything she wanted and needed. So there wasn't a lot to pressurize her. So this journey that she takes into the underworld is very indicative of our journey into the shadow self, where we have to peel back the layers, where we face challenges, where we have to unclothe. And she got down to the underworld and saw her sister and tried to give her sister love and support, but her sister was grieving, deeply grieving. And here is the more popular sister who has it all coming down, who hasn't lost anything, who isn't suffering, and Ereshkigal in her rage just took it out on Inanna, lost it with her, and basically sentenced her to death and hung her upon the wall and left her for dead. And you know how we've all had those moments where we're reactive, from a place of grief and pain, and afterwards there's guilt, shame, remorse, but in it, it's just like, and that's where Ereshkigal came from, and basically left Inanna. But in the meantime, Inanna had done some work up at the top, and she'd asked her faithful handmaiden to look for her. So in the meantime, 3 days passed, and the handmaiden started looking for support and help to try and get Inanna back from the underworld. Whilst in the underworld, the horrendous task of putting her sister to death, on top of the grief of losing her husband, and now the grief of her reactivity, had forced Ereshkigal into labor. And the pains were heartbreak, the pains were physical, the pain was just, I mean, I really can recognize this kind of pain that I feel like Ereshkigal was in at this moment, where just everything was too much, and she was trying to labor this baby on her own, and just absolutely shattered and tormented. In the meantime, our faithful handservant goes to Inanna and Ereshkigal's grandfather, and he is not very supportive at all. He just says, what was Inanna thinking? That was a crazy thing to go down into the underworld. Well, she's done that. She's got to figure it out. So the handmaiden goes to Inanna's father and says, this is the story. Can you help? And he's just also, same sort of response, like, really? I can't help her. What was she thinking? She's crazy. She's got to fix her own problems. So no masculine support. This particular part of the Venus story is very much like the empowerment of the inner feminine, irrespective of your gender, but we are a group of women in this case. So this is where, you can't expect the white knight to rescue you, or the king or the prince to rescue you. This is where the deep depths of our feminine wisdom are kicking in. So finally, her handmaiden, at her wit's end, goes to the third masculine energy archetype support that Inanna has had in her life, and that is the god of wisdom, Enki. And because Enki has actually been one of those gods who's done his own underworld journeys, and he understands that this wasn't a stupid thing she did. This was a challenging thing she did. This was a transformative alchemical thing that she did. He offers some assistance, and he takes some dirt from underneath his fingernails, and he magics up a couple of insects, and he tells these insects to go and sneak into the underworld and go and plead with Ereshkigal for Inanna's return to the land of earth and sky. And so they do. When they get down there, Ereshkigal is moaning, and she is laboring, and she is grieving, and she is bereft, and they can't help but support her and basically midwife the birth of her dead lover's child. And when she finally births this baby, with her dead sister hanging on the wall, her husband gone, she's so relieved to have had somebody show up and support her in this time of utter bereavement. And so she says to these insects, what can I do for you? The kindness, the compassion that you've shown me, what can I do? And they say all they want is Inanna's return to the land of earth and sky. So Ereshkigal concedes defeat in this. And anyway, I think she probably felt relieved that she could actually undo something that she probably hadn't really meant to do in the first place. And so Inanna is risen from the dead and sent back up with these two insects. In the meanwhile, on the way back up, she gets to pick up the garments that she'd shed at the 7 gates and reapply them to her person. But each time she puts on one of those garments again, it's as if she has changed somehow. The garment is changed somehow. She is just not the same. She can feel the journey out is a very different journey to the journey in. She is older and wiser. We might say more jaded, more weary, more cautious. It could be so many things. And I think we all know this kind of journey. And obviously, the more consciousness we take into these underworld journeys and the coming back into the outer world, the more potency we can recognize that we're gleaning from them, but it's happening whether we're very conscious of it or not. Anyway, she gets up to the top, but one of the things Ereshkigal tells her before she heads out is that nobody can ascend without sending somebody in their place. There are certain rules of the underworld, and those are just the rules. So when she gets to the top, her beautiful handmaiden and close friend runs up to her, so happy to see her. And she's like, Inanna, you're back, and embraces her. And the guards that Ereshkigal has sent to take the soul that she will be sending back are there. And they say, well, we'll take this one. And Inanna is like, no, you cannot take her. She has been so loyal. She has been my closest confidant, not her. So they're like, okay, then who? And her sons run to her and they're like, mother, we've missed you. We're so glad you're here. We've been trying to keep things together in your absence. And she embraces her sons and they say, well, we'll take one of them. And she's like, not my sons, not my beautiful, loyal sons. And then she sees her husband in the distance and he is absolutely fine. He's not grieving her. He's barely noticed that she's gone. He's enjoying himself with the extra power. He has taken over that where she stepped out, he has stepped in, and he's actually been appreciating this journey. He can do what he wants. He can be with who he wants. And so in her own fit of fury and rage, a little bit like her sister had with her, she says, take him, because he's not actually, doesn't have any like love or respect for me. So he's the one that is taken to the underworld. Now, we might look at that and think, well, let's not shoot every husband or partner. But that's just how the myth goes. So take it as you will. But really thinking about that retrograde process is the journey into the underworld. And Venus has several phases in her, just like the moon has phases, all the planets have phases. Venus's phase is a little bit more complex than the moon. The moon's a beautiful place to learn because she has a very stable, fast, simple process. Venus is a bit different, but one of the things that she has is for 9 months of the year, she works in like gestational periods as well. For 9 months of the year, she is morning star, and I think it's 9 months. And 9 months of the year, she is evening star, and in between that, she's invisible because she's so close to the sun. And at one point of that, she is actually in a retrograde process, which is her beginning a cycle. And an entire Venus cycle is an 8-year period. So 8 is a Venus number. So when you see things happening in 8-year increments or whatever, you know you're dealing with a big Venus cycle. And this is definitely in our astrology something we can dive into, and we can really understand our own Venus stories in a much more in-depth way, which is very fascinating. But like I said in the previous video, we mainly want to start with understanding the energy of Venus, as in where is my Venus, what sign is my Venus, maybe what Venus star point was I born under, which I also pointed out in that last one. And that would have been where the underground story was happening. The closest one to when you were born would be what shows up for you there. So in my example, I was born in a Scorpio star point. So that was the closest Venus star point to when I was born. So those are about as far as we're going to go now. But when we hit the actual Venus retrograde in July, late July, August, I want you to think about this Inanna myth and allow yourself to do this deep descent into the underworld of yourself, into the journey of yourself, and think of all the things we've spoken about Venus representing: love, value, worth, work, wants, desire, attraction, those sorts of things, and reflect on where that has been working for you and also where you need to delve a little deeper. So I hope that myth has been interesting for you, and we will jump into the chart looking now.